Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is April 3rd, 2022, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's a pleasure to be joined in dialogue by members of the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. To speak, I would ask participants to use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and I will call on you in order using your first name. As always, I have suggested 3 themes to focus our discussion, which are posted on the shared drive linked to the event notice on meetup.com. As we exchange thoughts on today's reading, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. We can go in any direction the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I welcome anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So today we conclude our reading of the Sophist, beginning at 254c, where we left off in our last episode. We will return in 3 weeks, after a break for Easter, and take up the sequel to the Sophist, the Statesman. The Statesman is the last in Plato's trilogy that began with the Theaetetus, with which we ended season 1. As we reach the final pages of the Sophist today, we discover the distinction that the visitor from Elea draws between sophists and certain rulers that we will encounter in the Statesman. Both are ignorant of that which they are imitating, but they use different means to achieve their ends. The sophist, he says, extracts his wages by using, quote, short speeches in private conversation to force the person talking with him to contradict himself, unquote. In contrast, the ruler who hides his ignorance, quote, can maintain his insincerity in long speeches to a crowd, end quote, and thus merits the name of demagogue, but not the value that he extracts from his unsuspecting subjects. Both the past and present provide us with many examples of demagogues who mock and distort knowledge in their continuing plague on human existence. We can consider today the central themes of the Sophist and perhaps relate them to Plato's other dialogues. I have suggested one such association to the Meno in respect of knowledge. Certainly the theory of the forms is among the more prominent, and we can see in the Sophist a particular focus on knowledge and its logical construction in speech and belief. In this context, the visitor explains the association and distinction of the 5 most important forms, having the names that which is, change, rest, same, and different. The form of the different, he says, is what allows us to say that which is not as a contrary of that which is, only as something other than that which is. And thus the visitor preserves the wisdom of Parmenides, whose admonition against the illogic of thinking or saying, in and of itself, that which is not, is related twice in the Sophist. The problem with the Sophist, the visitor says, is that they attempt to separate everything from every other thing. It is in this dissociation that the Sophist holds that which is not to be reality, no less than that which is, and thereby denies the existence of copies, likenesses, and appearances of a single reality. In the illogic of this disharmony and disunity of being, the Sophist will see himself incapable of falsity, since for him everything is, even that which is not, somehow and inexplicably a limitless reality independent of being itself. The Sophist is revealed, however, by the 5 most important forms, because they necessarily interact in the harmony of association with varying limits, which the Sophist will not admit. Some forms mix with others, some exclude others, some are common to all, and some cause division. But any way they interact, the forms are for all time a whole, with the characteristic oneness of their parts. Can logic operate in the past, the present, and the future by any other means, we might ask, if that which is not were to exist independently of that which is? So having generally defined the being of that which is as anything having capacity to do or to receive action, the visitor explains that in our spoken languages, we indicate a particular thing about being with both a noun and a verb. He provides examples to demonstrate that we cannot express meaning without the combination of at least one noun, as the name of the thing that does or receives the action, and one verb, which indicates the type of action. So recalling as we do from the Phaedo that everything comes to be in opposites, we might appreciate the means by which the visitor reaches an important conclusion at the end of the Sophist, by returning to the method of collection and division with which he began the dialogue. By continuously dividing opposites of nouns and verbs in two, the visitor compares production by humans to production by the divine, and reasons that both divine and human sources of production operate with the same two components, both the original things themselves and the copies of the things. Division of opposites in two removes the common factors to isolate the difference, which in this case is that humans can engage in production either with knowledge or without knowledge, while the gods have no such choice. So does this seem logical? What is logic and how do we express it? I thought we could take the first part of today's meeting to focus on the forms with your thoughts and with a refinement to the proposition that I introduced last week. But first, perhaps a short discussion on recent changes in the use of language, since language is a feature of this dialogue, might help to set the stage to understand the visitor's assertion that, quote, the weaving together of the forms is what makes speech possible for us, end quote. So let me start by presenting two of several recent changes in spoken language that I have observed, and please do contribute others that you can think of. So I wanted to start here with one particular point, which is the discussion of nouns and verbs at 262D, which says, since he gives an indication about what is or comes to be or has come to be or is going to be, and he doesn't just name, but accomplishes something by weaving verbs with names. That's why we said he speaks and doesn't just name. In fact, this weaving is what we use the word speech for. Theotetus is right. And the visitor says, so some things fit together and some don't. Likewise, some vocal signs don't fit together, but the ones that do produce speech. And he says, further goes on, he says, speech has to be about something. It's impossible for it not to be about something. So one of the things that occurred to me that seems to be happening in language these days is what I think is a confusion of noun and verb, and also the timing of the of what we apply the verb to. And so I've already spoken a number of times about one of my pet peeves, which is the use of the word impact in place of the word effect or the word consequence. So everywhere now, the word impact is used as a noun in that sense, in replacement of the word effect or consequence. But impact is also a verb. So in this part of the Sophist, the visitor is saying that we have to distinguish nouns and verbs, and each part of speech requires at least one noun and one verb. So the noun is the doer or the recipient of the action, and the verb is the nature of the action. So if we say impacts in the sense of nouns as in the sense of effects or consequences, how do we necessarily distinguish that from the verb impact, which means to strike something? And so I actually went back to a 1970s version of the Oxford English Dictionary and looked at the definition of the word impact at that point. And it was interesting to see that the word impact actually did have a relation to an effect, but it's defined specifically at that point as a strong effect. So it's not something that you would use with an everyday effect or consequence. It was only at that point something that you would use if the effect or consequence was particularly important or strong. And now it's come to be used in the sense of any effect or any consequence in the sense of a noun. So I thought this was an interesting change in the use of nouns and verbs, and also the timing of the verb. Whether the verb is or whether the action is happening in the past, present, or future. So if we say impacts, if we're saying it as a verb, that would be a present action. Something impacts the ground. As I watch it, it impacts the ground. As opposed to impacted, which would be in the past, or will impact, which would be the future. So that wasn't one example of something that I've spoken of before, but just I'm raising it now in the context of nouns and verbs, which the visitor talks about very specifically in today's dialogue. The other example is something that is really grating on me lately, and that's the use of the term was like. So instead of saying I said or I thought, people say I was like, and or he was like, or she was like. I was at an event and I said something, and he was like, really upset. So was like has taken the place of a verb. And the verb we're left to wonder in this case is, if we say he was like, does that mean he said, he thought, he reacted visually, he subsequently said something? So it's was like is taking the place of a specific verb, and we're left to wonder what that specific verb means. And that's something that's very, very common now. As I was walking down the street yesterday, just kind of listening to people use the word like, I realized that it's very pervasive. It happens very commonly in speech now. And that's something that I think is it's an interesting development, but I think it's a very confusing one as to whether we really know what they're trying to say when we say he was like or she was like. I'm just wondering where this like came about and why we've lost the ability to say the specific verb. And then I guess the other point is the something that comes out at 259D. So this is what I've got on the page here. And I'll just read this part of this point here from 259D. So this is the visitor saying, when he says that what's different is the same in a certain way, or that what's the same is different in a certain way, we should understand just what way he means, and the precise respect in which he's saying that the thing is the same or different. But when someone makes that which is the same appear in just any old way, or vice versa, or when he makes what's large appear small, or something that's similar appear dissimilar, well, if someone enjoys constantly trotting out contraries like that in discussion, that's not true refutation. It's only the obvious newborn brainchild of someone who just came into contact with those which are. And it goes on to say, in fact, my friend, it's inept to try to separate everything from everything else. And this is a very important point, I think, that the visitor makes about the sophist, is that the sophist, he says, tries to separate the being of one thing from everything else. So somehow there's this separation in the sophist's mind of things that are, and the sophist is never trying to bring all of the things that are into some sort of logical harmony or logical combination. So somehow this separation exists, and as I said in my opening comments, how do we distinguish reality if everything is separate, and including that which is not is separate? And so I think the use of that which is not, which Parmenides warns about several times in this dialogue, or Parmenides' words are quoted as warning about several times in this dialogue, is actually appearing more commonly in language now. And I used I thought of the example of fake news. So fake news is something that we've heard a lot of over the past, 5-6 years, something like that. So if news is, how can it also be is not, which fake implies? So if news is either news or it's not news, but how can it be fake? So it's like a contrary. It's like saying news is not. So that was one example that I thought of the way we're using language, and perhaps not heeding the warning of Parmenides, who holds that on its own, that which not cannot exist. So anyway, I just thought I would raise those 2 points, by way of introducing a few of the key things that are said in this last part of the Sophist. And I just wondered if anyone else has any thoughts on different ways that language is changing and how those changes might relate to what the visitor is saying in this dialogue. Steve, your thoughts?
2 points quickly. First off, I think it's good for us to bear in mind that the Greeks never came up with the concept of zero. So it took the Indian cultures and Islamic cultures. We got that concept. So when we have this rule set in place that you can't say that there's nothing, that's has proven not effective in the modern world. That to negate something is a way of understanding what that something is. When you say that, how can you have existence if there's no non-existence? And your other point about the word like, to me, that seems like is a simile. And similes are like metaphors light, that's my way of understanding them, and it's a way of comparison between two things. So it's a different form of expression, but it's I think a very effective expression, and perhaps it's because of the prevalence of the internet and people used to interrelating on much broader levels than they have in the past. So I think that the idea that like is diluting the language, I don't, and that might not have been your point. So I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying, James, but I think that it might be actually the evolution of language, and it seems like it might not be that bad of a thing.
Thank you. Those are fascinating points, actually, and I appreciate what you're saying about the simile. Actually, is a really interesting way of explaining it. I guess one of my points there was that by use of the simile, it leaves me at least a little bit confused as to the temporality of what's happening. Is what's happening in the present, is what's happening in the past or in the future, and what particular type of action is happening. I guess the simile for me takes away the specificity of the action. I'm left to wonder when we say he was like, whether that means he said, he thought, he did. The nature of the verb or the nature of the action to me is unclear at that point. But as you said, I mean, I think there's reasons why this has happened. It's interesting that we've moved from a more specific way of saying what the action was to a more general comparison type way. So you make some really interesting points, and your point about zero actually was something that I hadn't thought about, although I've been thinking about zero specifically on a number of bases. The zero mathematically has no effect on addition or subtraction, but cancels all multiplication. And I think that's maybe an interesting fact that we might kind of keep in mind, particularly with the sophists, and particularly with the idea of multiplication of these statements that things are not, if we mean that they are not in and of themselves, as opposed to the way that the visitor is saying is not can only exist if it's used in the context of difference of one thing to another. So it's only in the context of difference when is not means other than rather than a negation. But your point about zero is really fascinating. So I'm going to think about that more, and let's others weigh in on that too. So thank you for that, and we'll go to JK.
Another example, like you said, mentioned fake news, is the term alternative reality. And that's, if you, it was one that I think it was Kellyanne Conway who was, was talking to a reporter, and the reporter, asked her if, what some news about something was true and so forth. And of course, she couldn't, deny that. But she said, well, there's an alternative reality in which that's not true, or something like that. But in this dialogue, we're talking about reality, right? And is it a refutation of Parmenides' reality that that there is only being and that non-being does not exist? How, and also how similar or dissimilar is that to the idea of the forms, right? Because if there's only the being of the forms, and which seems to be what Parmenides is saying, right? There's only one form, there's only one reality, and there's no other reality, and there's no there is nothing contrary to that, right? So I just wanted some clarification about what that discussion is,
right,
regarding reality.
Right. And that's thank you, and that's certainly something that we will see as we start to talk about the forms. In fact, I've got this distinction that the visitor makes about the 5 most important forms. And then he goes on to say, so that which is one of the five most important forms, but so is the different. But it's his way of saying that the forms blend together. One negates each other. Some negate each other, like change and rest negate each other, or cannot blend together. But all of the forms together always blend. So it's always this logical harmony or this logical combination of forms that which is not cannot on its own exist in conjunction with that which is. So the only way that which is not can exist is if it's different or means something other than that which is. So that which is one. There is no negation of that which is. We can only have things that are different, but something can only be. There is no such thing as not being. So that's a thing that an important distinction that he makes. And we'll see. I think hopefully we'll get into that discussion shortly, and hopefully that will clarify things as we work through those five particular forms and the way that they blend together. I've actually in the notes I've actually tried to distill a couple of pages of the text into about a dozen points, which may help with that clarification. So yeah, thank you for raising that. And it's something definitely important to clarify. And then, you mentioned alternative reality, or I think maybe alternative facts was another term that was used. So, again, an example of language where it's either a fact or it's something other than a fact, but you can't have alternative facts. I mean, it's just, it seems completely illogical to say that. And that was a particularly striking example, I think, of this perhaps misuse of language, or at least misuse of a name. So the visitor makes the point that everything has a name. We give every specific thing a name. And so if you say fact, that name implies that it is real. And so how can you say that it's not real how can you say that something is real, and then you say in the other hand that it's not real? That's a complete confusion, I think. And that was a good example of an interesting use of language. So we'll move on to that clarification very shortly, I think, when we start discussing the forms. So thank you for that. And we'll move to Darren and then Jose G.
So I think there's a recognition on Plato's part and in his dialogue that language is really messy. So I think at the very start of the dialogue, we had Socrates ask Theodorus, "Are you bringing a visitor?" Sorry, let me try to find this. Thought I had it quoted, but here we go. So this is at 216b in the middle of it. And he asks if he's bringing a sort of God of refutation to keep watch on us and show how bad we are at speaking and to refute us. And then the visitor himself I was picking up on this stuff because I thought, like, throughout reading this dialogue, I thought it was interesting how they often pointed out how hard it is to speak certain things, or whether it's even possible to speak of some things. So this interface of knowledge and being with language, I think, is really fascinating, and how Plato acknowledges its difficulty. So I think an important passage here is at 267d, where the visitor, here they're drawing all these distinctions as we're heading towards the end of the dialogue, and we're finally hunted down and cornered the sophist. So here, when the visitor attempts to draw one sort of distinction, he says, where would you get a suitable name for each of them? Isn't it obviously hard to, just because the people who came before us were thoughtless and lazy about dividing kinds into types, and so they never even tried to divide them. That's why we necessarily lack a good supply of names. Still, even though it sounds daring, let's distinguish them by calling imitation accompanied by belief mimicry, and imitation accompanied by knowledge informed mimicry. So here he's actually had to reach for new terms or create new terms in order to be able to say what he wants to say, because our language like, unfortunately, our language isn't like mathematics. It's very messy. There's distinctions that need to be drawn that aren't drawn. And so we confuse concepts and ideas. And then sometimes, I think earlier in the dialogue, there was another interesting point about how we have sometimes like many words for one thing, and how some people like, I think he mentioned like old people or something. They like enjoy playing around with that. Like they enjoy like this sort of game in language, and they have a lot of fun with that, and they think you can say lots of like wise things with it. But it's just like but all this, I feel like the visitor, and I think the visitor is, it could be said to be representative of Plato here, maybe, is suggesting that, language, or recognizes that language is messy. So, and I'll just wrap up with final thought here. So, which is that I think this is part of the passage that James read earlier, at the very beginning, where sorry, I'm trying to just jumping all over this dialogue here.
What was it? 259D.
Yeah, right. So, 259D. Exactly. That's exactly the spot. And where he says, when someone says that something is different or is something, we need to understand just what way he means and the precise respect in which he's saying that the thing is the same or different. So, like, this is something we need to be conscientious of, because our language is messy. That it's possible for someone to say something is different or the same or whatever, and make a lot of cause a lot of confusion based on that. So there's a bit of sort of cautionary warning here, and it's probably no like accident that we wrap up the dialogue by turning to language again. Like that's sort of like the language, or the dialogue segues to the problem of language. And it's not a surprise that the dialogue's about the sophists, because it sort of all comes full circle at the end. Like we have all this like discursion about being, but then in the end we come back to language, because that's sort of where the sophist resides, and just playing around with all these potential confusions, simply because our language is very it's not like pristine. It's very messy.
Mm-hmm. You made some really interesting points there, and I think this messiness of language, or maybe the fact that I think, as Steve maybe said at the beginning there, that language evolves, and so it's never static, and it's always changing. So we always have to keep ourselves on top of these changes, as to what people mean specifically. And you made a very that part that you read just kind of at the end about needing to be precise as to why something is different, I think is very important. I think it's actually increasingly important, especially as you consider this desire by some corporate entities, and maybe by some other people, to abandon what is natural reality and to move into what's called the metaverse. So if we have enough trouble distinguishing knowledge, which is communicated by language, and I think that's maybe the importance of language that's really being emphasized in this dialogue, is that language is the means by which we communicate knowledge. If we don't understand that communication, we're not being precise as to why things are different, then if we kind of abandon this reality that we're trying to live in together and move into some metaverse type of, manufactured reality, where will that leave us? So I think it's a very critical point that you raise, and this evolution or messiness of things, that it's something that we need to sort out. And I think that's really what he's trying to say with this dialogue. Such a key part of what he's trying to say with this dialogue. So thank you for that. We can certainly return to those themes and explore them further. And we'll go to Jose G. and then Steve. Jose?
Yeah, first of all, a quick adjustment to what Darren was saying. I think it is more, the language is not messy as much as our use of the language. And in that respect, I would agree. But it's the use of the language, not the language. another distinction that I would make is, if you notice, the language changes first with the teenagers. And we all have been teenagers, and we all try to use the language that everybody else uses because of acceptance, insecurities, whatever you call it. But then I noticed the like, for instance, many, many years ago, I started to notice it with the teenagers. Like almost like saying right, like. And all of a sudden I said, well, that's a teenager thing. And I started to see it with adults. Now, I will make one example. And if you notice this, when you observe the lawyers, in the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, the judges, when they are conducting their business, they don't use like ever. They only use like when they're talking to the press. They want it to be a little political about certain things. And once I asked my lawyer, why is it that you guys never use like? And he said, like what? Obviously. And said, well, like using an analogy or a metaphor, like when I turn on the car and all of a sudden there's this noise, like when I go for a vacation. And he said, because metaphors or analogies are subject to interpretation. That was a very interesting word. In other words, saying, if you want to speak clearly, don't speak in analogies because it's subject to the interpretation of the receiver. Anyway, that was one example. And finally, I wanted to mention that once I came across that this fellow, this philosopher, Wittgenstein, had written the fact that philosophy was not a problem, that all the problems of philosophy were problems of language. That caught my attention, right? And I wrote it down as one of my 233 to-dos to read once about this fellow. But then I read that he, in fact, in another reference, that he had recanted that. He had turned around and he had rewritten his initial thesis about the language. So I don't know what to think, but I thought it was a good starting point for him to start pointing the finger to the use of language that creates a problem that doesn't exist just because we are misusing the language. I mean, the concept seemed fascinating, but as I said, I have to clear 232 to-dos before I get to that one.
Thank you. And I if you've got 232 to-dos, I might have 233, but it's one of those things that we and certainly what you just mentioned about Wittgenstein is really something that I actually would like to look into myself. It's something that I actually tried to read a little bit of him some years ago, and it's something that I really should get back to, especially now knowing what you just said about this, whether he thinks that there's language is the problem or not. It's a really fascinating thing. But I find your use of the example of lawyers was actually really interesting and quite relatable. The fact that the word like leaves us or leaves some room for interpretation, and so that's something that maybe that we need to consider, is to what extent can we interpret things if there are more people and more different ways of using the language. I think that's quite important. I think you mentioned teenagers, maybe being on the forefront of some of the change in the language. And I wonder if some of that is as a result of technology as well, because certainly when I was growing up, there was no internet and there was no texting and there was no short forms like LOL and LMAO and IMHO and, all of these things that just sort of now people are expected to understand because we use these short forms in our texting, and that's something that, technology can certainly drive changes in languages. And I think probably the internet has been a major driver of change in language, just in the use of these short form communications and in the transition maybe away from spoken language to more text driven language. And that's maybe something that we can explore as well, that change, when you use words, you can use nuances and tones in your voice to express meaning, whereas in a text message, you have to express meaning a little bit differently. So certainly an important point. I wanted to raise it because I mentioned in the in my introduction that I've tried to draw some analogies between different dialogues, and this is something I always do. I think in every session that we have is to try to put the common points that Plato, touches on in a number of different dialogues together. There's this one particular part that I really like in Meno, and I've mentioned it before. This is 98a in Meno, where Socrates says, "For true opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine thing, and all they do is good. But they are not willing to remain long, and they escape from a man's mind, so that they are not worth much until one ties them down by an account of the reasons why. And that, Meno, my friend, is recollection, as we previously agreed. After they are tied down, in the first place, they become knowledge, and then they remain in place." And this really struck me, in the context of the Sophist, that if we're using language to communicate knowledge, then language has to give that account of the reasons why. It's something that I mention actually in every notice that I post for these events, is that knowledge is the account of the reasons why. That just really strikes me. And in this little part from 98a and Meno is also repeating what he says in a number of different dialogues, that knowledge is recollection. And this is something that I bring about in my particular definition of the forms that I mentioned last episode, and I've got a refinement today that I'd like to present for some thought and discussion, and to see what other people think the forms actually are. But I think they are a means of recalling knowledge. So this is just something I wanted to mention, because the account, if we're giving an account with our speech, either in spoken words that flow through the mouth, as Socrates, or as the visitor mentions in this dialogue, or in thought, which is a form of speech, but it's a speech that occurs with the soul, by itself, with itself. And that's a distinction that's made near the end of the Sophist, is that there's that form of internal speech. Either way, we're trying to give an account, and how is that account complete if it's unclear? And so, Jose, you mentioned this whether something is subject to interpretation, that can give rise to uncertainty and unclarity. And I think that's something that we need to consider. So I just wanted to mention this point about the Meno that I brought into this to the notes for today's session as well. So let's go to Steve, and then maybe we can look at the form specifically. Steve.
So what Jose mentioned about teenagers and the change of language made me think about when I was a teenager. The big thing we all were saying was "far out," and I made me also think about Marshall McLuhan, who was a philosopher of that era, who talked about, from some of his books were like was archetype to cliche. So you see, things like "far out" was something that nobody could understand, but I think it's more of a cliche now. There's things like again, there are the expressions "turn it up to 11," which is like, again, I can't stop saying it. It's a expression that was from a movie. People say "I grok it," which is an expression from a science fiction book, but it's generally understood by a wider group of people than ever read the science fiction. Another one of Marshall McLuhan's book was "Media Hot and Cold," and he described the changes in medium. In that time, it was from print and movies to TV. So he described how language was changing to reflect the type of media that was prevalent. And the type of media that's prevalent now is the internet. And this could also be just a change of expressions, not necessarily less clear, but just more adapted to the type of media that we are using these days. And just briefly to close out about the change in difference. No, I'll leave it at that. I'll just leave it at that so we can move on. Thanks.
Thank you. And those, I think, are really interesting points, the far out. And if we go even maybe a little bit further back, the word groovy. which I used to know somebody use that word all the time. Things are groovy. That's kind of really 60s word. I like it though. It's I find it interesting. It's very action driven, I think. So, and your use of McLuhan, I think, really interesting. Actually, use of McLuhan. McLuhan is someone who I've spent a little bit of time with, particularly in the context of his 1962 book Gutenberg Galaxy, which I'm actually using some excerpts from in the book that I'm writing. And certainly he highlights in that the then new technology in 1962 of television, and in fact the screen itself, which, you know, when I go back and I read the words that he wrote in 1962 in Gutenberg Galaxy, I find that I can apply them actually very, very much so to the screens that we now use. I mean, the screens that we now use are not necessarily television, but they are still two-dimensional screens having length and width, but no depth. And the depth on the screen is the perception of the person who is creating that image on the screen. And we are consuming that we're limited to length and width. In the depth on the screen, the depth is not our perspective, it's the perspective of the person who's prepared or filmed that image and is presenting it to us with the opinion that's inherent in the depth of that image. So it's really interesting, and certainly, as you mentioned, that you know, the idea of archetype to cliche, that's something actually I'm going to look up in terms of how McLuhan used that. I'm really interested in the way you introduce that word archetype. So thank you. Well, I think those are some really great thoughts on the evolution of language, and they really touch on, you know, a couple of the very key themes in today's reading as we, you know, conclude on the Sophist. You know, the idea that every time we speak, we have to have at least one noun and one verb. The noun being the doer or the recipient of the action, and the verb being the nature of the action, the verb describing the action itself. And certainly the visitor gives a few examples of how you cannot speak with all just nouns or all just verbs. I think he gives a couple of very interesting short examples of that near the end of the Sophist. And then certainly this idea of falsity. Falsity can only exist if being is chopped up into all sorts of infinite parts, which never reconcile, never tie together in some sort of logical harmony. And that's why repeatedly through the Sophist, the point is made that being has no contrary. So that which is not cannot on its own exist. It can only exist in the context of the different. And so that's maybe a way of introducing the idea of the forms. And, you know, let's just discuss the forms. I want to, you know, kind of get people's thoughts on what you think the forms are. And I'll present, maybe if I've given an opportunity, why I think the forms are in some more precision than I presented in my opening remarks of the last session. So I'll just maybe start by reading this part at 254C to introduce the thought, and then I've made the logic from 255C to 257B. There's a couple of pages where there's a series of logical developments on the nature of the forms and how they associate. And I've tried to distill them down into just, 12-point forms. So, or 12 different points. So we'll go to there. But I just thought I'd start by reading this part here at 254C, if you'll bear with me. So the visitor says, we've agreed on this. Some kinds of forms he's talking about, some kinds will associate with each other, and some won't. Some will, to a small extent, and others will associate a great deal. Nothing prevents still others from being all-pervading, from being associated with every one of them. So next, let's pursue our account together this way. Let's not talk about every form. That way we won't be thrown off by dealing with too many of them. Instead, let's choose some of the most important ones. First, we'll ask what they're like, and next we'll ask about their ability to associate with each other. Even if our grasp of that which is not isn't completely clear, our aim will be to avoid being totally without an account of them, so far as that's allowed in our present line of inquiry, and see whether we can get away with saying that that which is not really is that which is not. The most important kinds we've just been discussing are that which is, rest, and change. And we say two of them, and here's just a reference to the discussion of change and rest that came earlier in 250 to 251 that we looked at in our last episode. It says, we say that two of them don't blend with each other, but that which is blends with both of them, since presumably both of them are. We do have three of them, so each of them is different from two of them, but is the same as itself. But what in the world are the same and the different that we've been speaking of? Are they two kinds other than those three, but necessarily always blending with them? And do we have to think of them as them all as being five and not three? Change and rest are certainly not different or the same. Whatever we call change and rest in common can't be either one of them. Then change would rest and rest would change. In both cases, if either change or rest comes to be either the same or different, then it will force the other to change to the contrary of its own nature, since it will share in its contrary. And both do share in the same and in the different. So this is the start of this logical train as to how the forms associate and blend with each other. And it's not to say that every form blends with every form. Some forms clearly don't blend, like change and rest, which we looked at or started looking at in 2 weeks ago, don't blend with each other. Like you can't have change and rest simultaneously, so they can't blend. But the different blends with that which is. But I think what he's trying to say here is he's trying to tie all of these forms into some harmony and logic in their account. And he uses the word account several times here. And that's why I raised Meno, that 98, 98A, I think, from Meno. This idea of this account that we have to make with our knowledge. And so I'm thinking that the forms are very much some sort of knowledge accounting device. And so I wanted to raise that thought and to see what people think about this, and then also what you think about this idea of this blending or combination of the forms. Do the forms have to combine always as one, as a whole? We saw that in 2 weeks ago when we talked about the distinction between the whole and the one. A thing is a whole, but if it has parts, the parts have the characteristic of oneness. So that was how the words whole and one were tied together. So I just wanted to get some thoughts on this particular part here. And it's as I said, it's really the introduction of this part here from 255C to 257B that I'm just putting on the screen, where I've tried to summarize the logical development of this argument that's introduced that I just read from 254C. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, I wonder if this idea of the whole and the one violates the or qualifies with the Russellian paradox of contradiction. That if you if you have a whole, if a set can there be a set of all sets, and does that reach that qualify for that kind of paradox?
Really interesting question. The paradox that Bertrand Russell raised, and the way I like the way you put it. Can there be if everything comes to be as sets, and maybe we can think of as we've mentioned before from the Phaedo, the statement that everything comes to be an opposite. So if we think of opposite things or these pairs of opposites as sets, like the large and the small, the hot and the cold, maybe if we think of these things as sets, then as you said, is there a set of sets, or is everything necessarily just a set on its own? And maybe that's a really good way, JK, of raising this distinction at the end that is made about that which is, and the claim that the sophist thinks that which is equally exists with that which is not, and therefore there are infinite sets and nothing that ties them together. And maybe that's a really interesting way of putting this concept of harmony and logic in the consistency, the self-consistency of the forms. I really like that, actually. It's Russell's paradox. I mean, what do you think about that? What do others think about that?
Yeah. Also, would Gödel's consistency theory apply here too? The idea that if it's consistent, it's not complete, and if it's complete, it's not consistent, right?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I haven't heard of Gödel's. I guess I've always heard of it as the incompleteness theorem, but as you say, it's then talks about consistency. Yeah, really interesting thoughts. Really interesting thoughts. I'm going to think about that. But I think certainly this, the question of how you get consistency if there's incompleteness, and the question of, is there a set of sets, a combination of all sets, and what do you call that combination? If each set is a whole on its own, what do you call the whole combination of all of the sets? Is it more whole than the whole? Really fascinating. And I think it's actually something that we will face with quantum mechanics, which are still not fully understood. And that's why I've put this little, I do keep talking about the qubit. The qubit is the unit that will transmit information in the quantum computer. And the qubit has two states of existence simultaneously, because quantum states are both exist and do not exist at the same time. So the qubit, so the quantum computer will entangle with the quantum physics of the universe and provide this superposition or simultaneous existence of that which is and that which is not. And this is something that is a geometric object. I think Plato would love to look at the qubit if this drawing were presented to him. And I put this, I won't read this, out for the podcast, but it's here in the notes for those who want to look at it. What I did with this drawing of the qubit is I actually managed to use the words capacity, which the visitor says anything which has capacity to do something or to have something done to it. And we saw that in 2 weeks ago in that part, in the middle part of the Sophist that we talked about. So I managed to use the word capacity. I managed to use the word that which is, the word change, rest, different, and the same, which are the 5 most important forms that the visitor raises. I managed to relate all of those 5 forms and the word capacity to this drawing of the qubit and my little explanation of the physics of that. So, maybe, JK, what you just talked about is very much relating to quantum mechanics and this difficulty of sorting out the simultaneous existence of that which is and that which is not, or the on and off states simultaneously existing. So I just put that because I always talk about the quantum computer and the qubit, and I just can't stop myself. So anyway, I will stop myself speaking and we'll go to Darren. Darren, your thoughts.
Hi. So I just want to make an observation, which is that there's something like 2 different things that Plato seems to want to say about the forms and how the philosopher relates to them. So I thought it was interesting, especially because the philosopher or being philosophical comes up in relation to these 2 ways of relating to the form. So I'm trying to 49. So this is at 259. He talks about the completely unmusical and unphilosophical person. So he says it's inept to try to separate everything from everything else. It's a sign of a completely unmusical and unphilosophical person. To dissociate each thing from everything else is to destroy totally everything there is to say. The weaving together of forms is what makes speech possible for us. So I thought this was so this is something that has already been brought up, that that James brought up, that the sophist tries to separate everything. But that's not what we want. But as I think we saw in at least this is how I'm reading this dialogue, what we saw in last week's, or the reading 2 weeks ago, which is that it's also a problem to sort of mush all the forms together and say like everything is one, like, or that everything is change, or that everything is the same. So he says outright explicitly at I think at 259b, that passage there, that that's not what we want to say. We can say that something shares in, for instance, being or change or whatever, but we shouldn't say that any of those things are the other things, because then that's a way of like lumping all the forms together into saying that there's no distinguish. It's like everything is just one. I feel like he's pushing against both. So as we saw also last week, I mean, there's I think there's so much evidence of this. I know maybe some people won't be satisfied. People who want to think everything is one or whatever. I mean, maybe there's a way in which that is true, but this just comes back to the point of having to be careful using language and what exactly we mean by that, though, because there's a lot of things which we probably don't want to say and don't want to mean by that, as Plato's working out in this dialogue. So sorry, I'm looking for this. This is at 249b. He talks about how the philosopher. Sorry, no, this is a lower down. Oh, right. Sorry, at D, at 249d. So here the philosopher comes up again. So I actually think it's interesting, because like occasionally he'll mention like being philosophical or the philosopher, and I feel like that's when like we should pay attention. So he says the philosopher doesn't should be like the child begging for both, and say that which is everything is both the unchanging and that which changes. So like the philosopher doesn't want to say that everything is change, which I think like someone like Heraclitus says, although I'm not an expert at ancient Greek philosophy, but I believe that's true. I think we saw that in the Theaetetus, that dialogue, where he tries to refute Heraclitus, the idea, much more explicitly and at length than here. So anyway, so just to sum up, like I think as we saw in the reading today, like he wants to push against the temptation for people to like separate everything into pieces, and he says that's like unmusical and unphilosophical, because the philosopher wants to weave things together, wants to weave the forms together to be able to say something that is. And then but then we also, I think in the previous weeks we saw that we also don't want to be like all those other people, the people who he said that are in endless or in an endless battle with each other, like people who want to say everything is change or everything is one or whatever. So perhaps like everything shares in that, like maybe we could say that, like you have to work that out, but like you shouldn't say everything is those one or those, like that's sort of like pushing everything together. Like we don't want to do that either. Like it seems like there's some frustration with that temptation as well. So it seems like he wants to so that's just my observation, that like there seems to be contrasting things he's pushing against in the readings in these different weeks.
Really interesting observations there, and I think maybe when you raise that debate as to whether everything is one or everything has changed, maybe really foreshadows our discussion on the Parmenides, which will come up after we finish with the Statesman. And so I think that's a good way of raising that. But I think it really very much ties to today's discussion. And you raised a couple of points, which I've got on the screen here. You did go to 259d again, and there's that important statement in there, the very bold claim in there that the weaving together of the forms is what makes speech possible for us. And I've underlined that and put that in bold here. And I think that's a very daring claim. And I'd like to see if anybody objects to that. Is this claim correct, or is it possible that speech is made possible by other means other than the weaving together of the forms. Very important point. I mean, speech again is how we communicate externally through sound, but internally in our minds. It's that discussion that the soul has with itself, and then as between people, it's the spoken noise that comes out of the mouth, as the visitor says. So I think that's an important point. And then you raise that section from 249A to C, I think, which is an important section as well, which I could read maybe shortly too. So I think that's something that we definitely need to consider. But as we think about the forms and the nature of the forms, very clearly the visitor is saying, it's not possible for everything that is in existence to separate from everything else that's in existence. There is this harmony, there's this bringing together, there is only one logical entirety that all of the forms can exist in. That there aren't these separations that chop them all up, and somehow they are not tied together, because that's the point that you mentioned from, I think it was back in 249b, when you refer to the philosopher as kind of requiring some musical skill, and music maybe meaning harmony here, which is something that is a term that's been used a few times in this dialogue. So the philosopher has to harmonize or bring things together so that there is some logical consistency. So thank you for raising those points, and we'll go to Moshe and see where we want to take this. Moshe?
Hi.
Hi.
The idea of weaving the forms together, I've been trying to wrap my head around most of this conversation fairly unsuccessfully. The idea of weaving the forms together is, if I can put it in analytic terms, it's the idea of creating what the empiricists would call complex ideas, or what the analytic philosophers would call the construction of concepts. Because if you take a concept like cancer, okay, there is no such thing as cancer in reality. There are all these individual diseases that make it up, and all these different malformations of genes and molecules and things like that we all tie together under the concept of cancer, so that we're able to talk about it, and we're able to raise funds, and we're able to declare war on cancer, and all of these things. And if language was completely atomistic, and what I mean by atomistic is that we had a noun for everything, and there was a separate noun for every separate thing. You can imagine, if you go to the beach and each grain of sand had its own name, it would be impossible to talk about the sand. It would be impossible even to have a good day at the beach. You're just going to run out in the water and drown yourself. So I think this, to me, Plato makes sense when we can keep in mind what Plato is saying, but put it into, I don't want to say contemporary terms, but I mean relevant terms like language being atomistic and everything having a name, which is what he's trying to talk about, and take metaphors like weaving together the forms. Do I take I don't take knitting needles and find the forms wherever they are and knit them together, but he's talking about constructing complex ideas, constructing concepts. And I think that, at least for me, that makes it easier for me to understand what's going on in this dialogue.
Well, thank you, Moshe. I mean, I found actually what you said to be really helpful, and really, I think it puts it in a really useful context that is, you use the word atomistic, and I think that's a really good way of thinking about what the visitor is saying about the sophist. The sophist atomizes, creates a separate entity for each thing. So somehow each thing has a separate existence, not tied together with other things. And and I really like the way. Unfortunately, I'm not up to speed on modern philosophy, but I really like, I was getting a sense from when you use those two terms, complex ideas or constructive concepts, that this idea that language is a construction and thoughts and ideas are a construction. They build together, and a construction to me is some sort of form of harmony. And that, I think that's very much what the visitor is saying. And I really like those two terms. I think really put it in a way that I can understand, that you have to take each part, which is not a separate atom, but it's all part of a unity, and you put it into some complex structure or some constructive concept. But you can't say each part is on its own completely separate from every other part. And I think it's a fundamental basis of reality that the visitor is trying to say. And he's trying to say that the sophist tries to say that we split everything apart, and there is no necessary harmony of all of the parts. All of the parts do not add up to a whole. And the analogy that you used of the beach, it was brilliant. I'm thinking of this, the beach with billions and billions of grains of sand, and trying to put a name to each piece of sand as if it exists on its own. And when you said it's like running into the water and drowning, it's certainly if you stood there and tried to put a name to every grain of sand and treat every grain of sand separately, well, then how would you conceive of the beach? It would just be a collection of names that would not tie together into some one thing that we call a beach. It would just be billions and billions of different things. And that really illustrates the point that I think that the visitor is trying to make about names. We give names to things that are distinct, but these distinctions all have to tie together at the end. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to re-listen in the podcast. I'm going to re-listen to what you just said, because I think it really does help to put this in context. So thank you very much for that. JK, your thoughts?
So on the other hand, is the sophist, positions also a refutation of the position of Parmenides of positing that there is only this unity of the whole, of the one, and it's a kind of a way of in Zeno's paradox, it's a way of spatializing time and not taking into consideration the atomizing of reality. That there are these particular, separate entities, right? But that they are just, everything that is just part of the same single whole. So the sophists are really kind of complicating, right? Complicating the idea of this oneness, right? That everything is a unity. So it seems like Socrates is also trying to can be considered a sophist in that sense, that he is complicating the idea of the concept of just of oneness, that there are these such things as the difference and these differences within the whole one is what makes language more precise, right? And not get caught up, deluded by this sense of unity.
Good question, and I think it is something that is definitely complex. And I think this may be, one of the questions I was going to ask is, I think there has been objection to the forms over time. I'm not a student of Aristotle. I need to learn, in fact, what Aristotle says, or at least through what his students wrote, what he said. But my understanding is that Aristotle rejected the forms, and then others have rejected the forms too. So to the extent that some reject the forms, I'd be interested in knowing what the basis of those rejections are. I think one basis certainly is the complication that you talked about. We want to know what something is versus what it is not. And that's complicated. It would be nice if we could say with clarity what something is, or what its particular name is. But here, the visitor is saying it's complicated because it things mix together. Some things mix, some don't. Change and rest don't mix together. But they are all part of this mixture of these 5 most important forms, that which is change, rest, the same, and the different. Those are the 5 most important forms. And it's in the mixture, in the combination and association of those forms. So even though change and rest don't mix, they do associate with each other. And it's in those associations that meaning is derived, and that we can express things like that which is not, which doesn't mean that that something both exists and does not exist. It means that something is different from that which is. That's all it means, is that it's different. It doesn't mean a negation or a contrary. It means that just something is different, and that becomes complicated. And maybe that's a point that we can take in the summary that I prepared from 255C to 257B, which is I've tried to boil this complication down into 12 points that may be easier to follow than some of the language in the text. So I'm happy to go through this. I'm happy to go through this if it helps. So thank you for raising that point. We'll go to Bill.
So it seems that these forms are part of a unity, and but you give the example of change and rest. They may be different, but they can from rest you can go to change, and change you can go to rest in an instant. So they are related closely, actually. I think they're not that different. There's a potential for making one into the other very quickly. So that's one thing, and both are needed for the whole. Both are necessary. They're an integral part of the necessary. And without them, without one form, then the whole is altered. It's not whole. It's missing something. So those are my two points I wanted to bring up.
Thank you, and I think they're great points. Use the word integral, which has a mathematical concept as well. An integral is where you take a series of infinite things and you bring them together and you integrate them into a whole thing, as opposed to a derivative, which is where you look at the differences. So that's kind of the mathematical concept of that. But I think it ties very much, or harmonizes, we might say, with what you said about potential. And to have potential is to have capacity. And that's what the visitor has said exactly is required for anything that we say it is, has to have capacity or potential, the potential to do something, the potential to interact either as the doer of something or as a recipient of an action. So the doer of an action or to receive an action. That is what the visitor, I think, is saying is potential. And as you said, both are necessary. Both change and rest are necessary. And the fact that we can move from one to the other and back means that capacity or that potential always exists. So that otherwise there would be static. If there was only rest, there would be static. If there was only change, there would be, just complete confusion. Like nothing would ever be. Things would just continually be coming to be without any sort of logical order or consistency. So I think what you said actually really, those 2 points really are quite helpful. So thank you. Now I just wonder maybe if we can go through, if we want to go through this train of logic here, or Darren, you had a point?
I just, because so earlier you asked like what we thought about the forms, and I just want to, like, before we move forward, I just want to say that you can make one more observation about.
Sure.
I thought was something I found interesting about the discussion about the forms here. And this is about regarding the nature of the form of the different, and I think this is a really interesting one. So he says, sorry, I use the page numbers of my like actual text rather than, so sometimes
If you give me the page number, I've got the same text as you. So
Right. It's 40, bottom of 48. So okay, so this is just where he talks about the form of the different, and he says at 259e, we've not he's just summarizing here, but then so I'll just start reading here, I guess. We've not only shown that those which are not are, we've also caused what turns out to be the form of that which is not to appear. Since we showed that the nature of the different is chopped up among all beings in relation to each other, we dare to say that that which is not really is just this, namely each part of the nature of the different that's set over against that which is. So I think you read this at the very start today. And but what's really interesting to me about it is that the form of the different sounds like a kind of relationship, a kind of it's how things that are relate to each other because they're different. You have to be different from something. I think so. I was actually trying to find this. I couldn't find it, but I'm pretty sure at one point he said that he said something like, in order to be different, you have to be different from something. So different is always a kind of relational thing. You can't just be different on its own. That makes no sense. And so if we're talking about forms, this just seems like a really maybe this is using language foreign to Plato, but it just sounds like a kind of a very basic concept that we have to have in our minds about how the world works. And he says how but how things are different, of course, there's many different ways in which things are different. So it's not like, things are all different in the same ways. But so just recognizing that, there is this form called the different, that doesn't really get us anywhere, but it does, of course, it is part of what so much of knowledge relies on, maybe all of knowledge, actually, this idea of relationship. So it's not science per se, this is the metaphysics of science, right? So that's the way in which the form, we might be able to say that the form exists as a kind of metaphysics of our doing science. And I think that's what he's getting at. It's kind of, we're never going to figure out, you can't figure out very specific things through this discussion about the world, but it is telling us that maybe any knowledge of our world has these forms at its inherently, in the very structure of our thinking and speaking about the world, this is there, that's the way it makes sense. And so, but I just find this this particular, I think this idea of the different is I just feel like it's something really important. I'm going to wait to say more about this. I think there might be more about this in Statesman or and I think in the Parmenides too. I think the idea of properties that are relational rather than just there on their own. I think that's I think there's just something significant about it. So that's just my observation. That I feel like this particular form is fascinating for this reason.
Absolutely, and I think you touched on a point that the visitor did make, that the different is always different to something. So it is always, you can't say different unless you relate it to something. That is different from that one is different from that other. So it always has to relate to something. So that is that relational nature of the different that makes it important. And it's why he says that the different, like that which is, they both are pervasive. They pervade all of the forms. So that's an important point that he makes. So again, and then we get into this problem or this complexity of the combinatorics of the forms. So the forms are combining, but change and rest don't mix together, but they are part of the mixture. I think that's the key point that he's trying to make is that this mixture contains elements with varying capacities. They don't each have the same capacity, and one of the different capacities of the form of the different, is that it is always necessarily relational, while some of the other forms are not necessarily relational. So I think that was a very important point that you raised, and certainly when you talked about the forms as maybe the nature of our knowledge, and you mentioned science. Is it almost as if the forms are the science of science? I see the forms very much as the way we recall knowledge, and I think that's. I will raise my definition very shortly of the forms. The more precision that I added to the definition I raised last time, but thank you for that, and we'll go to Steve and JK, and then again we can look at this train of logic and the definition of the forms. Steve.
I think that Darren raised a very important point. I think the way that the Greeks looked at things like difference and change, they're believing that there's a inherent existence in them. But if you take something from Buddhist philosophy, the philosophy of dependent origination, you're saying that the things in themselves don't have any inherent existence. Things only have relevance as their relationship to each other. How that the cause and effect, that from this comes that, so that there is no change or difference just by itself. The only way that there is any meaning to it is, or anything that's inherent to that, is by its relationship to other things. And I think that the way of looking at things are the relationship view is what we've been talking about, is like a set theory type of view, and that's what the paradox with the sets are. But there's also category theory, which I won't delve into, but I think it relates to what Darren is talking about. And I'm not a mathematician, so I couldn't delve into it. But I think that going forward, it's an idea of maybe looking at things in a relation, how things relate to each other, rather than just how we classify things, how we make things into nouns. It's more about the only way we derive any meaning from one thing to another is their relationships with other things.
That really made me think, Steve, that you asked, is there inherent existence? And it made me think, again, of my favorite little qubit. I don't see any inherent existence in the qubit. And this is what's going to transmit information in the quantum computer, which is coming up, I think, a lot sooner than people think. And we're going to have to deal with this very soon. Information will transmit in this particular geometric device, which is a sphere with a triangle rotating in it. And is there anything inherent in this, or is everything relevant, or relative, not relevant, relative? And so you made the distinction between sets and categories, and this is something that I've been meaning to. This is on my 233 list of things to do, is to spend more time with set theory and category theory, and as JK mentioned earlier, Russell's paradox. I think these are all important things that are really helpful to understand. And I think maybe if I'm understanding what you said about sets versus categories, maybe if sets are the way we classify things, categories may be the way we relate the sets together. And so that if that's an appropriate meaning, I think that's a very important thing that I will think more about. So thank you very much for that. I've got JK and Moshe, and I noticed Mike has hands up. And so Mike, maybe just because you haven't spoken before, I would go to you, and then I'll go back to JK and Moshe, if that's all right. So Mike, welcome.
Oh, thank you. What I'm about to say, I only vaguely understand. The issue of whether it's a 1 and a 0 is, and it could be both simultaneously, is solved when you collapse the wave function. And interrogating the qubit lets you collapse the wave function, so then it becomes in an equivalence that the cat is no longer alive or dead. It's either alive or dead. And then if you have a let's say 48 of these qubits as a word, then there's an infinite number of possibilities that occur. I'm not sure if it's 48 factorial or whatever, that are solved in one machine cycle, and that is the magic with the device you're talking about. Now, whether that's there's 3 problems, maybe more than 3 problems. The first of those problems is that that the thing is running at a fraction of a degree above absolute zero, and so your cooling problem for your device is really extraordinary. That's why they only have they can't build a quantum memory that can store the entire Google database, for example, which then would be interrogated instantly rather than have to wait 30 seconds or 30 days to get the answer. So I don't know if any of this that I said is really true. And also the issue, another issue that occurs, they really haven't solved the error rate problem. So they get a whole array of possible answers when they collapse the wave function, and then they decide that one of those is true. And so it's created some magic, but it's not there yet. So I don't know which. Apparently, some of you have worked with these devices, as I have, but never really successfully. And I don't know that anybody, even with the seed state events that they've said we've solved the problem, that they really have solved the problem. And thank you. This is not a statement. My stuff is not a statement, but a question as to whether anything I said is really true.
Well, thank you, Mike. And certainly talking about the quantum reality and the difficulty of translating what we think is reality, but we don't fully understand, into a machine. So we're trying to connect the machine with the quantum realm, but we don't understand the quantum realm fully yet. I think it's very relevant to the Sophist. In terms of, you mentioned the waveform, for example. So when you make an observation of a quantum effect, it's said to collapse the waveform so that what could be one or the other, and you use the example of Schrodinger's cat, which is either alive or dead, we don't know. But when you make an observation, it makes that reality become one or the other. And I think that becoming one or the other, collapsing the waveform in the context of quantum mechanics, is important in terms of that distinction that the visitor from Elea is making in the Sophist between that which is and something that is different from that which is, which we can say that which is not, but that doesn't mean that it's a negation of that which is. It just means it is something different. And I think in this qubit, we can see the potential or the capacity for difference. And that's why I've used the names of those 5 forms in my little explanation here, the physics of the qubit. So I think it's an interesting relation to make. And certainly, as the supercooling problem gets resolved, and it is being resolved. In fact, they are developing quantum computers now that do not require supercooling because of new materials technology. I think that's what will really make these things become widely used a lot sooner than people think. And it's a significant problem that we need to resolve. And I think we can find some of the keys to resolving that problem in Plato's Sophist and in other dialogues that he writes, just in terms of understanding the nature of reality. So thank you for that. Moshe and then Bill.
Hi again. I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this idea of the different, and I don't think that the idea of the different is immune from a contradiction. And let me flush it out this way. If something is different, it's either different, it's different from something or different to something. So if something's different from a triangle, it would be another shape. If something is different from a square, it would be another shape. But another shape and another shape are the same. So then the difference is the same. And that's a contradiction. So what I'm saying here is that the idea of the different has to be flushed out in such a way that it doesn't entail any sort of contradiction. And I don't think we have any idea of what that would be unless we start to fall into this atomistic problem that I mentioned before, or that has been mentioned before. So I'm just putting that out as my own quandary to this. I think that I think that Plato, this is a problem in Plato, I think in general, because this idea that a form, in order for something to be something, it has to be not only itself, but it has to be different from an infinite number of other things, is a problem. Because how can you have how can he maintain the idea of a pure form if it's got to be different from all these other things? Because the difference in one form would vitiate the purity of all the other forms in some way, I think.
And thank you. I think that's really key to the issue that exists with interpreting the forms, and so I mean, one thing I would say is just again to highlight what the visitor is saying is that these differences aren't hard distinctions. The differences only arise because the forms are always combining. The forms are never uncombined. The forms are always somehow associating, but they associate in different ways, which means that these difference is actually what gives rise to capacity. I think both in mathematical functions, difference gives rise to a capacity for change in the mathematical result. In geometry, difference gives rise to different shapes. And you mentioned shape, so for example, we can't say that a circle is the opposite of a triangle, but we could say that the circle is different from the triangle. And each therefore has different capacities. I think to take it back to the point that the visitor made 2 weeks ago when we were looking at it, he says that the capacity to do something or to have something be done to it is what makes something be. It makes that which is. So yeah, thank you. And I think, again, as you said, the understanding of the different is absolutely the key, because, the visitor makes a point that different pervades all of the forms, but then he's also making the point that all of the forms combine, but in different ways, in varying ways. So I think that's a key point to keep in mind, to keep those points all together in mind. And it certainly is complex. So thank you. And we'll go to Bill.
You mentioned the circle and a triangle being discrete. Well, one can make a circle into a triangle and vice versa by straightening the lines a bit. That's one thing. The other thing is, you're talking about things that are different, and I haven't followed the discussion completely because I've been away, but I think there was some talk about that the forms are different, and then there is and or not is. And if you look at in the physics world, you can look at a particle, and then 1 minute it's a particle, and then it's a wave function, and there's only a probability that one or the other will exist. So it's not whether it is or is not; it's a probability in the physics world.
Interesting observation. And for probability to exist, you have to have more than one thing. Because if you only have one thing, then there's no probability, there's only certainty. So the existence of a multiple of things, I think, is what gives rise to probability. And again, so if we think of the forms, and to mention what Darren brought up earlier, this debate which comes through in the dialogue Parmenides, which we'll look at the end of the season, is everything one or is everything changing? That's the debate there. And so if everything were only one and had no parts, then there would be no probability, there'd only be certainty, and there would be no change because everything is one. But then conversely, if everything is only change and never one, then there would be no probability of outcome because there'd be no outcome. There'd just be continuous change. So, maybe to put it into computer science type terminology, maybe that's, one relevant thing that we might want to think about. So I think it's a good point that you raise, and certainly that word probability, I think ties very nicely with the idea that the visitor brings to the table, which is that anything which is has capacity, and probability is what we deal with when we've got two or more things that have capacity and difference. And I think it's the way we really interpret things and think about reality is in these concepts. So thank you for raising that. And we'll go back to Mike.
Tying Bill's comment to the quantum issue, it's not either a wave or a particle. It's both a wave and a particle at the same time, and although whether tying that to complex belief, they say Jesus is not either a God or a man. He's a man, 100% man and 100% God. If you accept that paradigm. Which, like everything else, I'm not sure I accept any paradigms. It's both a wave and a particle, and Jesus is 100% man and 100% God, and it's not probability. It's again this complex way of looking at things, which it defies our imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, certainly in this drawing of the qubit, we've got the wave, which is denoted by the Greek symbol psi, and then maybe the point is where the X, Y, and Z axes meet together right in the middle, which is none of it. So, and this is something that we have to understand. But I think, Mike, as you said, if we're not sure, what something is, whether it's a wave or a particle, or something that we're talking about, and you use the example of Jesus, at the end of the day, if we're communicating, we have to arrive at some conclusion. And the conclusion is, some sort of combination of of our experience and the thoughts and ideas that we share. And I think that's the important part, about the nature of knowledge in this whole thing, is that to transmit knowledge, we have to, we're always transmitting with uncertainty, but somehow in our getting together, we try to resolve that uncertainty into something that is more certain, knowing that we can never be fully certain because of Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So, we just have to live with uncertainty. But I think the point of language and communication is so that we can overcome most of that, and we can work together in some sort of harmony and combination, with some love of knowledge, with some philosophy, to approach the challenges that face us. Because if any one of us tried to do this alone, we would never be able to survive. So the only way we can survive is if we survive together. And I think the very important point here is that it's the way we communicate with each other. It's the words and the names that we use and the verbs that we use that really convey these ideas and thoughts. So maybe I'll use that as a segue to introduce my definition here in about 7 lines, and let's see what people think. But maybe I can go to that section that I've condensed and distilled from the from 255C to 257B in the remaining time that we've got, which is only about 15 or 20 minutes, to kind of really drive down into the forms and get what people think about this. So this is, I put this under the heading, what do you think the forms are? And then I'm putting my proposition. So I'm not saying that this is what the forms are. I'm not saying this is not what the forms are. I don't know what the forms are. I'm uncertain, but I take all of what I've read from Plato, from this dialogue, from Timaeus, from Phaedrus, from Phaedo, from Parmenides, all of the dialogues, and I try to put it all together. And this is what I come up with the forms. So allow me to read this if you would, and then we can discuss it and bring forth your own ideas, and then we'll go through that train of logic. So I'm saying the forms are the means by which our minds, in the eternal realm of being, recall the logical order of cause and difference in the variable state of coming to be of the present, to which all physical objects are limited. The forms are geometric, but in order to provide the mind a complete account of the physics of coming to be, the forms neither exist in nor affect the geometric limits of space and time that define the present. There are no physics in eternal being, which has neither past nor future, and therefore no present to divide it into two parts. Being, which is a domain of the mind, is one without limit, having capacity for neither increase nor decrease in its infinite density. Being just is, at all times, its own derivative. And, that, my friends, that's the best I can do with the forms. Taking an understanding of how Plato has distinguished the present as the state of coming to be, in which everything changes, but is always subject. So in the state of coming to be, there are limits, but everything is always subject to the state of being, which is eternal. The state of being is in the past and the future. The present divides it into two. The present involves this continuing change, which involves limits, but there are no limits in the state of being. The state of being is unlimited. It just always is. It has its own derivative. And that is the best that I can do with the forms. And this really, in my mind at least, gives a lot of logic, at least to the way I understand what Plato is saying about the forms. And so I present this as my proposition. I don't present this as fact. I present it for discussion, and certainly we can proceed on this, through our future sessions as well, because I think the Statesman will feature the forms, and certainly I think if we don't want to drive into the forms, then we won't understand Parmenides when we get to that dialogue at the end of the season. So I put this on the table, and Bill, your thoughts?
Well, I had another thought about forms. Sure, there are forms making up the unity, but if we concentrate on the forms, then we'll miss the larger picture. I think the larger picture being the unity of everything. So I appreciate the conversation on the forms and the focus on the forms, but if we don't bring them all together, then there is no unity. So.
Absolutely. And a good point. And I think I would like to think that what I've written encompasses unity, especially when I say the forms provide the mind a complete account of the physics of coming to be. And to me, that's the unity of it. And in terms of what the Sophist, the discussion in this dialogue is that the forms associate variably, but they do form a unity. And precisely because the visitor says they are not chopped up. Each form does not have its own separate, distinct existence apart from all of the others without association with the others. Association is necessary. So, as you say, I don't think the forms can be understood unless their unity is also understood. And a good point. Absolutely. I would agree. So thank you. Steve, your thoughts?
Question. On the very end of this, you're saying being just is at all times its own derivative. Could you expand a little bit about what you're meaning by saying its own derivative? What you mean by the derivative, and what you mean in that sentence, please?
Mm-hmm. Well, two things. I think when I use the word derivative, I'm thinking about source. So there is no other source for being. That ties with the idea that the visitor is saying that there is no such thing as not being on its own. There is only being. There is no other source of existence. So I'm thinking of the word derivative in the term of source, but I'm also thinking of it as mathematically that which changes. And so because there is neither the capacity of increase nor decrease in being is infinite. it's incapable of change, and therefore it's its own derivative. It's mathematically its own source. All of the change is contained within it. Just like the base of the natural logarithm e in 2 dimensions, and the 3-dimensional analog, the Riemann zeta function, and the 4-dimensional analog, the gamma function, are their own derivative. Nothing, they require nothing else to generate their capacity. They are their own derivative, and that's kind of maybe from a mathematical context that I'm thinking of. But certainly in the way that Socrates, or not, sorry, in the way that Timaeus and the dialogue Timaeus presents the realm of being, it's very distinct from the state of coming to be that we exist in the present. And I think that's what adds to this complexity, because we look around us and all we see is the state of coming to be. But that is constantly changing, always subject to entropy, and it's never fixed. It's always changing. But being is capable of neither increase nor decrease, and I think that comes clearly through in Timaeus, and then in just every other dialogue. I see no inconsistency in Plato at all. I think Plato is absolutely consistent throughout all of his dialogues. There is no experimentation with ideas. All of it is pointing to the same thing. That's how I see it. So thank you for the question. JK?
Yeah, if you say being is infinite, right, then that would entail the notion of non-being, and if at the same time is a finite being able to conceptualize an infinite being. It's an assumption that we are, that Plato is, I guess, making that we can, right? That there are infinite or finite minds can conceptualize an infinite being and conceptualize non-being.
Yeah, important. Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't say that I can conceptualize infinite being, but what I can say is that by using the forms and the line of logic that the form takes us on, or that the forms take us on, in the way that they associate and in the way they mix in varying ways, it takes me closer to that infinite state of being. But that infinite state of being is not accessible absolutely to the minds of we who are physical beings, because we're always subject to the Heisenberg state principle of uncertainty in physics, that the more you know of the position of an object, the less you know of its momentum, and vice versa. The more you know of its momentum, the less you know of its position. And then there's also Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So, we exist in the state of coming to be, but our existence is in two parts. We exist as a body, which is subject to the physics of the state of coming to be, but also with a mind, which is inside the body, which is in the eternal realm of being. So we've got one foot in both realms in the sense. We've got the mind in the realm of the infinite being, and the body in that ever-changing state of being. And that's why, for example, in Phaedo and in other dialogues, Socrates says, you can't trust the senses. The senses are delivering that ever-changing information. And your eyes can tell you lies, your hearing, your smell, your taste, your touch, all of these things, they don't deliver the truth. You have to use reason to determine the truth from all of this data to make sense of the meaning of it. So I think that's a point. And certainly the idea that the realm of coming to be of the present, what I'm trying to say in my definition that I proposed here, is that's the realm of limits. And in the realm of being, there are no limits. It just goes on forever. And so, when the Sophist says that each name has its own limit and is not necessarily attached to other names, that's where you get into this infinite recursion of being and not being existing at the same time and negating each other. And I'm saying that can't be, because being is unlimited. If there were limits to being, then it would be possible to have being and non-being at the same time contradicting each other.
Right. Yeah. There's some religious traditions that that in order to get closer to an understanding or a comprehension or a experience of being, they repeatedly negate, what they just, right, conceptualize. And also this correlates with quantum physics, because right now our lack of understanding has produced something like 9 or 10 different interpretations of what the quantum, realm is, and our understanding of it. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
And certainly an interesting point that you raised. So thank you for that. As I say, as we continue in 3 weeks, as I said before, we'll take a break for the Easter long weekend. But when we continue in 3 weeks with a Statesman, I think we will see this continuing complexity. But I really do think that having reached some basis of at least understanding of what Plato is saying in terms of the forms mixing together, blending, but in varying ways, I think that's absolutely key to reducing some of that complexity to a more manageable level, and just really trying to answer in your own mind what the forms are and what the purpose of the forms are. As I'm saying here, I think it really does have to do with this recollection. I use the word recall, the logical order of the cause and difference in the variable state of coming to be of the present. And, it was in the Meno that Socrates says all knowledge is recollection. And then he further goes on to say that it is the account of the reasons why. So I've used the word account, I've used the word recall. I think the forms are some sort of memory device, not device, but because they don't exist. If I use the word device, then that means that they exist in physical space and time, which they don't. But I think they are in fact, we had one participant in Plato's Cafe a couple of episodes ago who didn't speak during the episode, but she spoke afterwards. I think it was Jenny, who said that the forms are a mental model. And I really am trying to build on that idea that they're mental model, but they use geometry, and they use the geometry of combination and association, mixing in various different ways, which geometry helps with, and requiring number and calculation, which Socrates says is the first order of business of knowledge of the philosophers, of number and calculation. And I think that's why the forms, if this is kind of the way that our minds are able to apply memory and then to recall from memory, then I think this is the way it could work. And necessarily, I mean, the universe is geometric. The physical universe is geometric. I mean, Einstein proved that with his field equations. There's tensors in there. There's scalars. There's metrics. Like it's all of those. In 8 pi g, which is a very interesting concept too. So. The physics are fundamentally geometric. So then why would our understanding of the state of coming to be, which is, involves the geometry of physics, why would that understanding not also have to be geometric in a way? Like if we're understanding the geometry of physics and Newton's laws of motion and Einstein's field equations, then I would think some geometry is required in that form of understanding. So, Bill, your thoughts?
I think you mentioned before that Plato or Socrates, I can't remember who's the author of this, who said you can't rely on the senses. Mm-hmm. Well, I thought about that, and you really can't, because the human body is designed only with limited capacity in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum. We cannot see infrared. We cannot detect ultraviolet. We cannot hear certain sounds in certain wavelengths, or so the body's limited. So we interpret things according to what our body actually sees, and that may not be reality. The other thing is, in terms of the mind, is the mind operates in a similar way that it's been designed to limit us in terms of certain detecting certain inputs or reasoning in certain ways? Are we inherent limited, or can we use our mind to expand to a limitless way of thinking?
Really, really fascinating question. I would like to think that we can use our minds to expand. I don't know if the mind has the capable of infinite expansion. It is, after all, an electrical organ. It uses, I think, about 25% of the body's electricity. And so there's only a certain amount that you can actually ask the mind to do, because it's only has a limited amount of power. But maybe then the question is, when we combine our minds with each other, and we've got, maybe 7.8 billion people on this planet, if we combine all those minds together, what could we create with the combination of all of those minds? If instead we weren't fighting each other, if we weren't committing wars and acts of atrocities on each other, but we actually used all of this energy that we have to actually combine and actually work together, with 7.8 billion minds working together, I would like to think that there would be quite the expansion. And we would get ourselves out of a whole lot of problems that we just currently find ourselves in, because we don't understand this whole blending of things. We don't understand the ways things mix together. We don't communicate with each other clearly. And I think that gets us into a whole world of problems. And that's why I think the Sophist is absolutely so powerful. I completely missed this the first few times I read the Sophist, but now it's coming out so clearly. And as you said, the body does not have the ability to sense certain wavelengths of energy, like infrared and microwave and all of this stuff. So and not only that, it's everything that it does sense is subject to interpretation. Like, we want to color our thoughts or our perception of things with what we think is going on under the scene. Like, if I see somebody who looks sad, I might think that they are sad, but maybe they're not sad. It's just something, it's a conclusion that I've leapt to. So you can't necessarily trust the senses. And I think Socrates makes that point very clearly in Phaedo, Phaedrus. It's just everywhere. I just find it everywhere in Plato, that you have to go, and in the Republic, in the Republic, he says you have to use reason. So I think that's an important point. So thank you, Bill, for that. Steve, any thoughts?
Just point of order sort of thing. You had said that Einstein proved that the universe was geometric. My only quibble with that is I'd say that he didn't prove the universe was geometric. He proved that the universe could be represented geometrically.
Right. And that's a good point. And I would also say that when he was talking about universe, he was talking about the physical universe. And Plato makes the distinction that is the visible part of the universe, but there is also the invisible. And certainly Einstein's field equations do not address the invisible. They only address the visible. And it's the way that we interpret the visible. But the invisible very much is as well. And I think that's where we need to go with science, is to understand the invisible. And that's what's in the mind, I think, really. And that's why philosophy is so important. And in conjunction with physics and science, I really think philosophy is the science of science. And that's why I'm so happy and proud to be able to present these discussions and to involve people in discussions, because I think that's really the next level of human existence, is where we go beyond putting things in equations and saying, with certainty, and we start dealing with uncertainty, which I think is the next realm that we need to get ourselves into. Bill, did you have another thought, or was it? Maybe what I wanted to do is, just because we are running out of time, we're actually a little bit over time, I won't have a chance to get to this, but I will leave this. And I posted the notes in the chat box, and these are also posted on the shared drive. So I will let people read this, but I think it's quite important. So what I've tried to do, and I've mentioned this before, is from 255C to 257B, there's a train of logic, and it goes on, it's a couple pages long to read. And what I tried to do was to boil this down into the essential points. So I boiled it down into 12 points. So I'll let you read these 12 points, but these 12 points explain the distinction between these 5 most important points that the visitor is talking about. And I really think that these will be key to our discussions on the Statesman, which will start in 3 weeks. So what I've distilled into 12 points here is the way that which is change, rest, the same in those 5 most important forms, interact, and in the way that some, like that which is and the different, pervade all of the forms, while others don't pervade all of the forms. So it's this mixing of the forms, I think, that is very important. I think as Moshe pointed out, that's a significant question that we have to come to grips with if we're going to accept the notion of the forms, and then also address the concerns of those who don't believe the forms are, and that believe somehow that existence is different from the way that they're being presented by Plato in the context of the forms. And so not only do we have to come to some conclusion on what the forms are, we also then need to talk about the objections that people raise to the forms. And I think only then can we arrive at some sort of collective conclusion. But I do think that collective conclusion will point to the nature of knowledge and the way that we understand and present and communicate knowledge. And I think that is what this world needs to move forward, instead of moving backward into war and destruction and all of these things that we've been through before, and we just seem to forget, and we do it again and again. And we just simply need to move away from that, because there is this collective knowledge that is waiting out there, and it's waiting for us to get together and use enough brain power to really access this. And the more we destroy that brain power, the more we destroy our own potential, the less we will have access to that infinite realm, and the more that we will always tie ourselves up in the limits of the realm of the coming to be, which is that realm that we can see around us. And it's not the invisible realm, which is infinite. And that's where we really need to get, is from this realm that we see around us, which is a state of coming to be, always changing, and we need to move into the far more promising and unlimited realm of being, which is not absolutely accessible, but I think we can move ourselves a lot closer to that. So thank you all. I guess I will end it there, and thank you all for participating. And boy, there was some really powerful discussions. As I said, Moshe, I'm going to go back and listen to what you said. JK, you said some really fascinating things. Steve, you made some points. Mike, Bill, Darren, thank you all for being here and for making some really powerful points that I think really add to the discussion, and I think will really move us forward in 3 weeks as we move to discussing the Statesman. So thank you all for being here, and look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks. And for those who wish to stay online, I'll stop the recording and we can just have a casual unrecorded discussion on philosophy, Plato, or any other topic that you would like to address for half an hour in Plato's Cafe. So thank you again, and those who wish, please do stay on, and others, I hope to see you in 3 weeks. Thank you.